All right. Greetings to all you beautiful people out there. This your girl Tiffany coming through live in effect right here on the StreamYard. So I'm streaming from both platforms of Facebook and YouTube. And if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, please do so because I'm looking to do more videos on YouTube as well. And if you are watching from Facebook, you just go ahead and share this video on Facebook, right? So today I want to do two topics, right? So we're going to talk about the topics of the Maroons and the Colonial Marines. All right, so I want to get into those two topics. So the other day I did the video about the Negro Fort, right, which is located what is now known today as Florida. So, but however, I have not got into details about the Maroons or about the Colonial Marines. So I want to do that. But before I get started, we gotta start off with this book right here in Yasasim. All right, in Yasasim, which is a tree word that means wise words or wise wisdom, right? This was written by Bob Baruti. So I'm gonna start off with this, and then I'm gonna get into the history. All right, so today is the 30th of July, and the quote for today is a child or a nation which is carried too long will never learn to walk. And this comes from Sam Greenlee. All right. And then this is what Bob Baruti had to say. We have helped enemies who want to set our children up so they will imprudently, though ignorantly, walk into the controlling arms of the state, create such a need for attention in them that they will run screaming with joy to anyone who will applaud them. We have done this because we are without a vision itself, that which others play for us. Because we have allowed ourselves to be carried for so long by the winds of others' cultural imperatives, we have forgotten what it means to stand on our own and, in many ways, lost almost complete memory of who we are. With our assistance, our children have become even better than us at being anyone but themselves. For those who do not know who we are, this is quite understandable. But for those of us who do, there is no excuse. Believe it or not, there are still Africans who consider themselves serious, center warrior scholars who send their children to schools with philosophies that do not embrace us. They voluntarily do this because they see these institutions as a safe place where their children can receive a quality education, continue to be profanely spoiled, and learn a little of our story so their esteem can be propped up before being shipped off to better, predominantly European racist institution. If we are to walk again as an African people, we must teach our children to stand as African warriors, not crawl as imitation European. And then on the bottom it says, I will not allow my children to be turned into imitation Europeans. So that is the quote of today by Bob Baruti himself. You know, being able to stand up on our own 2 feet and not be an imitation of those who have oppressed us. So a lot of us imitate those who have oppressed us because, again, that goes back to the fact that we have been domesticated. But once we start to learn more about our culture and learn about what our people have done and how they contribute, then we'll be able to re-embrace that culture that we had once before. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's get started talking about who the Maroons were. All right. So I want to show a couple of pictures, right? Now, it's going to be some animated picture, but it's going to give an idea of what the Maroon were. Okay, so this one right here is a picture of the Maroons right here. And these are like the descendant of the Maroons right here. Okay. So let's look at who were the Maroons. All right. Let's look at their history. As you can see, there's another image of the Maroons right here. Okay. Okay, well, that's not, it says the Indukula man bringing the body of a child before a shaman. That's interesting. All right. So let's go ahead and look at the history. All right. Here it is, Maroons. All right, and it says regions with significant population, North and South America. Languages, Creole languages. All right, religion, African diaspora religions. Okay. And related ethnic group, Maroon peoples, Black Seminoids, the Bush Neguin, Jamaican Maroons, Kalungas, Palicrios, or Palicrio, yeah, Palecrios, Colombia, Colombia. All right, historical group, Cimarron people, the small swamp Maroons. All right. So let's look at the story right here, shall we? All right, so Maroons are descendants of Africans in the Americas who formed settlements away from slavery. And it says Maroons often mixed with indigenous people of the Americas, eventually involving two separate cultures, such as the Jerufina and the Muscacos. Jerufina and the Muscacos. Who were the Jerufina? They are a mixed African indigenous people originally from the Caribbean islands of St. Vincent. And who are the Muscogos or Muscogos? The Muscogos were an African descendant group in Coahuila, Mexico, or are an African descendant group in Coahuila, Mexico. Yes. So you do have African Mexican or Afro Mexicans, as we call them, in Mexico. They go by the name of Muscogos. They are those descendants of those who are the Maroons. Yes. But let's continue. All right. Let's go down to the etymology. Now, see, the etymology, Maroon, which can have a more general sense of being abandoned without resources, entered English around the 1590s from the French adjective maroon, meaning feral or fugitives. So it came from the French word marron, meaning feral or fugitive. The American Spanish word cimarron is often given as the source of English word maroon, used to describe the runaway slaves communities in Florida and the small swamp on the border of Virginia and North Carolina on colonial islands of the Caribbean and other parts of the New World. Lyle Campbell says the Spanish word cimarron means wild, unruly, and runaway slaves. The linguist Leo Spitzler, writing in the journal language, says if there is a connection between English maroon, French marron, and Spanish cimarron, Spain or Spanish America probably gave the word directly to England or English America. The Cuban philologist Jose Juan Arom has traced the origins of the word maroon further than the Spanish cimarron, used first in Hispaniola to refer to uh, feral cattle, then to enslaved Indians who escaped to the hills, and by 1530s to enslaved Africans who did the same. He proposed that the American Spanish word derived ultimately from the Awakan root word cimarabo, cimarabo, constitute construct as fugitive in the was Arakan language spoken by the Taino peoples, native to the island. All right, so far, the word maroon, according to the definition, means those who were runaway slaves. Those who were runaway slaves or ran off the plantation. So they were African descended people that ran away from the plantation, basically. All right. So let's go into the history about the Maroons. And it says in the New World, as early as 1512, enslaved African escaped from Spanish captors and either joined indigenous people or ate out a living on their own. Sir Francis Drake enlisted several Cimarrones during his raids on the Spanish. As early as 1655, escaped Africans had formed their communities in inland Jamaica. That's why you got the Jamaican Maroons. And by the 18th century, Nanny Town and other villages began to fight for independent recognition. So these Africans, right, runaway Africans, they traveled to different places, such as Mexico and Jamaica, right, to escape the plantation of America. And even those in other parts in South America, they did the same way. They did likewise to just get off a plantation. So that's what they were doing during that time period. Okay. All right. And it says, when runaway blacks and Americans banded together and subsist independently, they were called Maroons. On the Caribbean islands, they formed bands, and on some islands, armed camps. Maroon communities faced great odds against their surviving attack by hostile colonialists, obtaining food and subsistence living, and as well as reproducing and increasing their numbers. As the planters took over more land for crops, the Maroons began to lose ground on the small islands. Only on some of the larger islands were organized Maroon communities able to thrive by growing crops and hunting. Here they were in numbers as more black escapes from plantation and joined their bands. Seeking to separate themselves from whites, the Maroons gained in power, and amid increasing hostilities, they raided and pillaged plantation and harassed planters until the planters began to fear a massive revolt of the enslaved blacks. So not only did the Maroons run away, but they also revolt against slavery too. So that's what they did. All right. And then go down here. It says the early Maroon communities were usually displaced. By 1700, Maroons had disappeared from the smaller islands. Survival was always difficult, as the Maroons had to fight off attackers as well as grow food. One of the most influential Maroons was Francis or Francois Macadal, a Hungan or voodoo priest who led a 6-year rebellion against the white plantation owners in Haiti that preceded the Haitian Revolution. So, before the Haitian Revolution, or what led to the Haitian Revolution, right? It was a guy by the name of Francois Macadal, right? And he happened to be a voodoo priest who led a rebellion against the white plantation owners in Haiti. So we'll look into who he was later. All right, but let's continue. All right, then it's gone on to say in Cuba there were Maroon communities in the mountains where African refugees who escaped the brutality of slavery and joined refugees Tainos before roads were built into the mountains of Puerto Rico. Heavy bush kept many escaped Maroons hidden in the southwestern hills, where many also intermarried with the natives. Escaped blacks sought refuge away from the coastal plantation of Ponce. Remnants of these communities remain to this day. For example, Velez, Cuba, and Ayuntas, Puerto Rico. Okay, sis, how you doing? All right, I ain't forgot about you. All right, so anyways, let's go ahead, go down to the part where it says the Maroon communities emerged in many places in Caribbean, St. Vincent and Dominica, for example, but none were seen as a great threat to the British as the Jamaican Maroons. A British governor signed a treaty in 1739 and 1740 promising them 2,500 acres in 2 locations to bring an end to the warfare between the communities, right? In exchange, they were to agree to capture other escaped blacks. They were paid a bounty of $2 for each African return. And then let's go down here where it says, beginning in the late 17th century, Jamaican Maroons fought British colonists to a draw and eventually signed treaties in the mid 18th century that effectively freed them a century before the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which came into effect in 1838. To this day, the Jamaican Maroons are a significant extent autonomous and separate from Jamaican society. The physical isolation used to their advantage by their ancestors has today led to their communities remaining among the most inaccessible on the island. In their largest town, Accompong, in the parish of St. Elizabeth, the Leeward Maroons still possesses a vibrant community of about 600. Tours of village are offered to foreigners, and a large festival is put on every January 6th to commemorate the signing of the peace treaty with the British after the First Maroon War. Now, let's look up the First Maroon War real quick. Okay, let's get that off of here. Okay. So, what was the First Maroon War about? It said the First Maroon War was a conflict between the Jamaican Maroons and the colonial British authorities that started around 1728 and continued until peace treaty of 1739 and 1740. It was followed about a half a century later by the Second Maroon War. All right, so let's read a little bit about the backgrounds, right? It says in 1655, The English defeated the Spanish colonists and took control of the most colony of Jamaica. After the Spanish fled, Africans that had previously been enslaved joined the Amorandian population and some others who had previously escaped slavery in the center of Jamaica to form the Windward Maroon communities. The area is known as today as the Blue Mountain. The white population on the island of Jamaica boomed between 1655 and 1661, swelling to roughly 12,000 white inhabitants. In 1662, however, only a little over 3,000 remained. And white population to slave worker ratio dwindled in the following decades, leaving a majority of slave and very few white settlers. British forces were unable to establish control over the whole island, so a large portion, and in particular the interior, remained in the hands of the Maroons. For 76 years, there were periodic skirmishes between the British and the Maroons, alongside occasional slave revolts. In 1673, a revolt of 200 slaves in St. Anne Parish created a separate group, the Leeward Maroons. These Maroons united with a group of Malagasy people who had survived a shipwreck and formed their own Maroon communities in the parish of St. George in northeast Jamaica. Several more rebellions strengthened the numbers of this Leeward group. Notably, in 1690, a revolt of 400 slaves at Sultan's Plantation in Clarendon Parish, Jamaica, considerably strengthened the Leeward Maroons. So, the first war was between the Jamaican Maroons and the colonial British because basically the British wanted to get rid of them, get them up out their community and put them back on the plantation. And they fought back. And eventually that's how they end up with the peace treaty. All right. And as you can see that the community of today is still around. So they're like an isolated community. I'm talking about the Leeward Maroons. They're in an isolated community, like nobody can really get into that area unless they have permission. All right, and so then let's look at the Second War. So what was the Second War about? All right, so right here, it talks about the Second Maroon War. 1795 and 1796 was an 8-month conflict between the Maroons and Kojo's town. A Maroon settlement later renamed after Governor Edward Trelawney at the end of First Maroon War, located near Trelawney Parish, Jamaica, in the St. James Parish, and the British colonials who controlled the island. The Windward community of Jamaican Maroons remained neutral during this rebellion, and their treaty with the British remains in force. A compound town, however, sided with the colonial militias and fought against Trelawney Town. All right. And then how did the war came about? All right, and it says the outbreak of the war, the Maroons of the Trelawney town felt that they were being mistreated under the terms of Kojo's Treaty of 1739. Which ended the First Maroon War. The spark of the war was when 2 Maroons were flogged by a black slave for stealing 2 pigs, and when 6 Maroon leaders led by Monteith Jones and including Major Jarrett came to British to present their grievance, the British took them as prisoners. They were acting under orders from the new governor, Alexander Linsley, 6th Earl of Belcarres, who wrongly believed that the French had infected the Maroons with their revolutionary spirit. Okay, Barcarres completely mishandled the dispute. which could have been resolved without conflict, but he ignored the advance of local planters and ordered his forces to put down the Maroons of Trelawney Town. Fighting began in mid-August. Okay. So, as you guys can see, there was two wars taking place with the Maroons. There was the first war with the British, and then there was the second war with the Maroons of Cujo's town, right? And also the colonial British. So again, they were really fighting with the British people to be able to have control and resource over the area which they have occupied since they escaped from slavery. So let's go ahead and look up some more information about the Maroons. Let's see what they're talking about. So what I have here is the PDF, right? And as you can see, the title said the Maroons enslaved community in South Carolina before 1865. All right, let's go ahead and look that up real fast. And let's see what they're talking about here. And it's called the Maroon and Slave Communities in South Carolina before 1865. Right here it says, all right, it's written by Tim Lockley and David Dodderton. In the past several decades, I'm going to try to highlight this, okay? Oh my goodness. There's some... Okay, there we go. All right, it says, in the past several decades, revision to long-standing concept of community have played a significant role in enriching our understanding of the complexity of enslaved life in North America. Few historians suggest anymore that enslaved people were inextricably bound together by shared oppression and works on topics as diverse as the informal economy, family life, courtship, and honor have effectively combined to refute the myth of idyllic slave community that Peter Cochin warned was at risk of developing from revisionist histories. And there has been greater focus on temporal geographical differences in enslavement as well as spatial distinction at play in everyday life. Methodological critiques such as Anthony Kay's have stressed the need to reformulate dynamics of exclusion and inclusion through more practical geographical specifics, right? In light of such scholarship, historians now emphasizes the nuanced, flexible, and dynamic relationship at the heart of multiple slave communities, continually in flux and inhabited by real people. In a recent historiographical summary, Jeff Forritt concludes that any romanticization of the slave community is rapidly drawn to a close. All right. And let's see what else they're talking about in this little article. Okay, so right here, it says, yet, while encounter between slaves and individual runaways have been used to provide evidence of division within the Black populace of North America, interaction between enslaved communities and members of another distinctive type of community, Maroons, have received less attention. Maroon communities were formed by escaped slaves in woods, swamps, and mountains throughout the southern United States. Although many runaway slaves left their plantation only for a short period of time and were either caught or returned voluntarily after a few days or weeks. Some had the skills and will form autonomous communities in the wilderness and had no intentions of return to slavery. These communities were organized comparatively free from white interference and offer us the opportunity to see how African Americans established themselves when they had a limited chance to do so. However, judging from the histography, maroon communities are viewed as less important in North America than in the Caribbean or Latin America. Right? So, again, to this day, do you still have maroon communities around? Yes, but they're not often heard or not often spoke about. Now, you may hear more about the Maroons in the Caribbean and Latin America, but you don't hear more about them here in North America, right? Because again, they're not really talked about, you know. So, and if they go to an area, if somebody was to visit an area of the Maroons here in America, they probably wouldn't even know that they're in that Maroon environment or in the Maroon community. They probably would just overlook it. So, that's how much that we don't know about the history of these Maroons and what they have done as far as slave rebellion is concerned. And as a matter of fact, you won't even hear about this in what is it, secondary education. You won't even hear about this in elementary school, not even in college, really. You know what I'm saying? So this is something that you have to do your own research on, and you have to really educate yourself on. So I'm going to read one more last thing about the Maroon, and then I'm going to get to the topic about the colonial Marines and who they were. All right. Okay. So, okay, so we're going to go down here where it says, this article concentrates on South Carolina because evidence of Maroon activity is more abundant for this state than any other. This is not to say that the Maroon communities were absent in other parts of the South. Maroons were active wherever and whenever slavery exists, especially in Virginia, North Carolina, and Alabama. Colonial slave population were, of course, more African and less acculturated than their 19th century descendants. Even so, Maroonage occurred from the oldest states among the Atlantic seaboard to the newest southwestern edition. As early as 1729, the governor of Virginia reported that a group of runaway slaves had settled in the fastest of the neighboring mountains, and he feared they would very soon be increased by the accession of other runaways and prove dangerous neighbors to our frontier inhabitants. While the Appalachians were attractive in the 18th century due to sparse European settlement, they did not retain their allure after the American Revolution as whites spread inland. In fact, the largest single Maroon community in North America was almost certainly formed in the Great Dismal Swamp on the border between Virginia and North Carolina. One visitor to the area in 1784 was told that runaway Negroes have resided in these places for, let's see, okay, for 12, 20, or 30 years and upwards, subsisting themselves in swamp upon corn, hulls, and fowls that they raise on some of the spots not perpetually underwater nor subject to be flooded, as 49 parts of 50 of it are on such spots they have erected habitation and cleared small fields around them. Yet these have always been perfectly impenetrable to any of the inhabitants of the country around, even to those nearest to and best acquainted with the swamps. Consequently, runaways in these horrible swamps are perfectly safe and with the greatest facility elude the most diligent of their pursuers. All right, so if you want to know more stories about the Maroons, all you gotta do is look up the Maroons and slave communities in South Carolina before 1865. All right, so there it is. And then there's the source information, the South Carolina Historical Magazine, volume 113, right here. There you go. You can find out more information for yourself. You're going to have to go on what is called jester.org, www.jstor.org, if you want to find out more information. So that's the information about the Maroons. So let's look up information about the colonial Marines. Give me a moment. All right, you guys, just give me one moment. I'll be back. I'll be resuming. Just looking up some information about the colonial. Okay. So the next topic is going to be about the colonial Marines, right? So come to find out, there is like two different type of colonial Marines. As you can see, right, this is an example of what the colonial Marine did look like. They were fighting with. They were pretty much soldiers that fought in the British Army. Um, when there was a time of when the British and the United States was going against each other and all that. So yeah, they fought in the British Army. All right. So and let's see if I can find some more information. Just give me a second, you guys. Let me look up real quick. Real quick. All right. All right. Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and Okay, so just give me a second. All right, so let's look up who were the colonial Marines were real fast. Peace. Hey, brother Consul, how you doing? How you doing, brother Consul? How's everybody doing today? All right. So real quick, because I'm not gonna be on here for too long. All right. So this is the corpse of colonial Marines, right? So they had two different type of corps. They had the first corps and they had the second corps, right? All right. So going down here, let's read where it says the history about the corps of Marines. Okay, so the corps of the colonial Marines were two different British Marines units raised from former black slaves for service in Americas. At the behest of Alexander uh, Cochrane, the units were created at two separate points during the war and were later disbanded once the military threat had disappeared. Apart from being created in each seas by Cochrane, they had no connection with each other. The First Corps was a small unit that served in the Caribbean from 1808 to October the 12th, 1810, recruiting from former slaves to address the shortage of military manpower in the Caribbean. The locally recruited men who were less susceptible to tropical illness than were troops sent from Britain. The corps followed the practice of the British armies, West India regiments in recruiting former slaves as soldiers. In the previous year, the Mutiny Act of 1807 emancipated all slaves in the British Army, and as a result, subsequently enlisted slaves were considered free considered free on enlistment. All right. So the first one happened to be, it was a small unit. It was not that many, but they were there only to serve in the Caribbeans or the Caribbeans. As the Caribbean people say, they say Caribbean. But no, they served in the war in the Caribbean during the 1800s. Okay. Now let's look up about the second one. All right, the second more substantial corps served from May of 1814 until August 20 of 1816. That's 2 years. The greater part of the corps was stationed at St. Augustine on the Atlantic coast, with a smaller body occupying the future Negro Fort on the Appalachia River in remote northwest Florida. Recruits were accepted from among escaped slaves who had already gained their freedom on coming into British hands and who were unwilling to join West India Regiment. The establishment of the force sparked controversy at the time, as the army of former slaves were a psychological as well as military threat to the slave owning society of the United States. As a consequence, the two senior officers of the corps in Florida right? George Woodbine and Edward Nichols were demonized by Americans such as Hezekiah Niles in his Baltimore publication, The Weekly Register, for their association with the corpse and inducing slave revolts. So these guys were seen as a threat, okay? Because they were not only the Marines of the British, of the British Army, but the British military, sorry, but also because they felt like they were threatening the Americans or United States felt like these particular soldiers was threatening the economy of the country, or before it was called a country, it was, the territories and all that. That's what they felt like. So they felt like this, if they had, the main concern the United States had was if there was slave revolts taking place, then that would cripple the economy of America. That means that America would not be making as much profit, because remember, that's how America gained a lot of profit at that time, due to the fact there was slavery practice. Due to the slavery practice, it helped build the American economy. So, yeah, you had the Industrial Revolution that came about, of course. Yeah, the Industrial Revolution came in, but still, there was some parts of America that was not ready to let go. They was not ready to let go. They was not ready to give that up. And that was the South. The South in particular, they wasn't ready to let go of slavery. They was like, this is how we making our money. This is how we building up our economy over here. The agriculture business is booming. Why we want to give that up? Why we want to give these people up? For what? You taking away our profit. And, let me give you guys a reminder. Andrew Jackson, right? Andrew Jackson, the president, for y'all that may not know, he's responsible for starting what we know today as the Democratic Party. Yeah, Andrew Jackson is responsible for starting what we know today as the Democratic Party. So everybody that's jumping on this Democrat bandwagon, okay? And I'm not saying, be a Republican either, because I don't choose either party, but you may want to go back and look at the history of the Democrats, right? And who were the ones that first started the Democratic Party? It was Andrew Jackson. He was one of the first presidents to become a Democrat. Yeah. And he was also the same one that destroyed the Negro fort where all the runaway slaves were at. He destroyed that area. And he also was the one that said, look, we're going to take over this territory, which is now known today as Florida. Because he felt like the Spanish people, they didn't have no type of power, to keep their territory under control. So he was like, hey, let's go ahead and take over Florida. So again, that's one of the reasons why Florida became a state, because of Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams, who was the vice president. Yeah, I think he was a vice president. Yep. So if you ever want to know where the Democratic Party come from, it was Andrew Jackson, and the Republican Party came about when Abraham Lincoln became president. But prior to that, there was no Democratic Party and there was no Republican Party. There was the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party was the main party during that time. But when these two guys came into office, this is when the Federalist Party became non-existent, and it was now just Democratic and Republican. So today, these two parties that you have now, you have the Democratic Party and you have the Republican Party. And you have different sets of Democratic parties and you have different sets of Republican parties. So, yeah, there's always some type of subclades within the main parties. Remember that there are always some type of subclades or subgroups within the main parties. But that's another topic for another day. I just want to throw that out there. All right. And so going down here, let's see. All right, at the end of War of 1812, as the British post in Florida was evacuated, the Corps Florida detachment was paid off and disbanded. Although several men accompanied the British to Bermuda, the majority continued to live in settlements around the fort the Corps had garrisoned. This legacy of a community of armed fugitive slaves with a substantial aerosol was unacceptable to the United States of America. After the fort was destroyed in the Battle of Negro Forts of 1816, the former Marines joined the southward migration of Seminoles and African Americans escaping the American advance. Members of the Colonial Marines uh, battalion, was it battalion? Yeah, battalion who were deployed in the Atlantic coast withdrew from American territory. They continued in British service as garrison and resident at Bermuda until 1816, when the unit was disbanded and the ex-Marines resettled in Trinidad. So these guys, right, that were the former soldiers of the British Corps, right, they went on ahead and escaped right along with the Seminoids and with the African Americans, and some of them settled in places like uh, Bermuda and other places like Trinidad. They settled in once the course disbanded. They just went on ahead and just fled because they refused to be under another enslavement, right? They refused to be under someone else's control, and that was the United States. They say, hey, we gonna get away too, because we ain't finna go for that. That was their attitude. All right, so let's look at post-war development real fast. Uh-oh. Okay. Now it says the war ended in February of 1815. The three European companies of the 3rd Battalion, Royal and Colonial Marines were sent back to Britain. With their departure, the battalion was reformed as the 3rd Battalion. Colonial Marines, consisting of 6 infantry companies of Colonial Marines and a staff of Royal Marines, right, brought from Canada. They performed garrison duty at the Royal Naval Dockyard at Ireland Island, Bermuda, and were carried from there in the transport Lord Eldon to disband in Trinidad on August 20th of 1816, near what is now known as Prince's Town. The former colonial Marines formed a free farming community known as Maricans, or sometimes spelled as Maricans, right? Under the community were under the supervision of their former non-commissioned officers. Households had 16 acres plots. These settlements were successful, and in 1847, their ownership of the land was formally recognized. The community of descendants retained its identity and commemorates its roots in an annual celebration. So they went on, right, and started their own little communities, just like the Maroons did. Okay. And let's go ahead and read about who were the Maricans real fast. Okay. Okay. So let's look up, as you can see, Moroccans. All right. So let's see. Who were the Moroccans? Let's look at the origin. During the American Revolution, the British recruit freemen for service as colonial marines. During the War of 1812, there was a policy that was somewhat similar, except that freemen were treated as free as soon as they came into British hands, and there was no condition, no bargains attached to recruitments. 6 companies of freemen were recruited into corps of colonial marines along the Atlantic coast from Chesapeake Bay to Georgia. After that war, the British settled these colonial marines in British Empire colonies, including Canada, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. Right? And Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, on taking over the command of British forces on the North American station of April the 2nd of 1814, issued a proclamation offering a choice of enlistment or resettlement. Okay, and this is what he said. Get this shit off here. It says, all who may disposed to immigrate from the United States will, with their families, be received on board His Majesty's ships or vessels of war, or at the military posts that may be established upon or near the coast of the United States, when they will have their choice of either entering into His Majesty's sea or land forces, or being sent as free settlers to the British possessions in North America or the West Indies, where they will meet with due encouragement. All right. So, okay, and it says the governor of Trinidad, Sir Ralph Woodford, wanted to increase the number of small farmers in that colony and arranged for the creation of a village for each company of Naparima Plain in the south of the island. Local planter Robert Mitchell managed the establishment and maintenance of the settlements, petitioning the governor for supplies when needed. All right. And so, okay, let's look up right here. Okay, it says company villages. Unlike the American refugees who were brought to Trinidad in 1815 in ships of the Royal Navy. All right, and let's stop right there. Let's stop right there where it says, unlike the American refugees who were brought to Trinidad in 1815 in the ships of Royal Navy. The next time somebody who is ADOS come and tell you that those people from the Caribbean don't have American descendants of slaves in their bloodline or their lineage, tell them to shut the fuck up. No, and let me tell you why I say that. Because as I read to you through these articles, right? I read to you about the Maroons, okay? I read to you about those who, I read to you about the Maroons, right? And as you can see, the Maroons, they located in different parts of what we know today as the Caribbeans. They located in the Mexico areas. So if anybody sit there and say, well, they not American descendants of slaves, yet they were. They were American descendants of slaves. They what you was called the Maroons, who were slaves that escaped from the plantation. And also, these were the same people that isolated, they started their own community and isolated themselves. Okay? So, anytime somebody from the ADOS community tell you, well, they're not American descendants of slaves, ask them to prove it. If they can't prove it, then you know that they're just talking out of ego. But let's go ahead. Unlike the American refugees who were brought to Trinidad in 1815, ships of the Royal Navy, or HMS Caron and HMS Levant, the veteran Marines were brought there in 1816 with their families in the hired transport of Mary and Dorothy and Lord Edmund. There were 574 former soldiers plus about 200 women and children. To balance the sexes, more black women were subsequently recruited. Women who had been freed from other places, such as captured French slave ships, the six companies were each settled in a separate village under the command of a corporal or sergeant who maintained a military style of discipline. Some of the villages were named after the companies, and the fifth and sixth company villages still retain those names. Right? And here it is, the villages in a forest area of the Napara Plain near a former Spanish mission, La Misión de Savana Grande. Each of the veteran Marines were granted 16 acres of land, and some of these plots are still farmed today by descendants of original settlers. The land was fertile, but the conditions were primitive initially, as the land had to be cleared and lack of roads were a special problem. Check this out. It is sometimes said that some of the settlers were craftsmen, more used to an urban environment, and as they had been expected, and some returned to America. But this comment applies to later free Black American settlers who came from towns, and not to the veteran colonial Marines who were all refused from the rural areas of Chesapeake and Georgia. The settlers built houses from the timber they felled, and planted crops of bananas, cassava, maize, and potatoes. Rice was introduced from America and was especially useful because it could be stored for long periods without spoiling. Okay. And okay, it says 20 years after the initial establishment, the then governor Lord Harris supported. I'll let you guys see that. Okay, there we go. Okay, yeah, 20 years after the initial establishment, the then governor Lord Harris supported improvements of the infrastructure of the settlement and arranged for the settlers to get deeds to their land, so confirming their property rights as originally stated on arrival. Though it is not clear that the initiative was carried through universally, as they prospered, they became a significant element in the Trinidad's economy. Their agriculture advanced from subsistence farming to including cash crops of coca and sugarcane. Later, oil was discovered, and then some descendants were able to lease their lands for the mineral rights. Others continued as independent market traders. All right. So let's look at religion. All right, so what was their religion practice? Many of the original settlers were Baptists from evangelical sects, commons in places such as Georgia and Virginia. The settlers kept this religion, which was reinforced by missionaries work by Baptists from London who helped organize the construction of churches in the 1840s. The villages had pastors and other religious elders as authority figures, as they was rigorous moral codes of abstinence and the Puritan work ethics. African traditions were influential too, and these included the Gayape system of communal health, herbal medicine, and Obia. Oh, Obia. I gotta write that down. Let me write that down. Give me a second, you guys. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about Obia later on. Let me not forget. Obia. Okay. Obia, African tribal science. A prominent elder in the 20th century was Papa Niza, Samuel Ebenezer Elliott, who was a descendant of an original settler, George Eliot, and renowned for his ability to heal and cast out evil spirits. His syncretic form of religion include veneration, right? Shango, prophecies from the Obi seed, and revelation from Psalms. The spiritual Baptist faith is a legacy of the Marican community. Oh, and then they got the famous Maricans. Somebody named Tina Dunkley, Hazel Manny, who is a Trinidadian senator and education minister. All right. Tina Dunkley is an American Museum director. Athena Manish, British textile designer. Brent Sancho, footballer, ministers for sports for Trinidad and Tobago. All right, so that's it. And you guys want to look up more information, there you go right here at the reference at the bottom. Black refugees of War of 1812. All right. Here you go. The Maricans. And then there go more information right there. All right. So, in all conclusion, as you can see, the Maricans, right, who were the former soldiers of the colonial Marines, who was also the former slaves, because they were former slaves that joined the Marines. And eventually the British granted them their freedom, said, all right, you done served here. So now you can go where you want to go in our settlement. So some of them were able to travel to Trinidad. Some of them were able to travel to was it Baruma? Yeah, Baruma. And some of them were able to travel to Jamaica, you see? And then the Maroons, they did the same thing. But the Maroons didn't serve in no armed forces. They escaped. And they was located into different places. All right. So with that being said, you had those Africans that were able to get away from plantations and settle into their own little small community and be under some type of autonomous society, or create an autonomous society to where nobody can get access or gain access to that area, right, without their permission. And then you had those who did serve into the Marines, and they also created their own society. So either way, each of these groups have demonstrated that they refuse to allow themselves to go back into slavery. They refuse to go back to the horror, going back to being traumatized. And yes, eventually you had those who did lose their lives, especially at the Negro Fort. Over 250 people got killed, thanks to Andrew Jackson. Then you had those who were able to just be free and was able to find them some land and live on that property and be able to have descendants. So this going back to the argument. So all those who want to talk about Oh, these people are not our descendants. They are not American descendants of slaves. For those who say all that, they don't really know the history. See, they're only getting the partial history. They haven't really studied thoroughly into the the colonial Marines and the Maroons. Because if they really did, right, they would know that these people of today that's in Trinidad, that's in Jamaica, that's even in Mexico, right? They are a descendant of those African ancestors who were either in the military, right, fought in the British Marines, or who would just escape slaves. They would know that. But this is what happens when you don't know your history. And I can guarantee you that somebody in the Caribbean can trace their roots back to America. They can trace their roots back to America. I can guarantee you that somebody in Mexico would be able to trace their roots back to America. Just like the people in Liberia, they are a descendant of former African Americans who were slaves. So the ADOS people are not just in the America or United States of America. The ADOS people also happen to be found in those Caribbean islands, in parts of Mexico, and in parts of Africa. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for watching, for tuning in. And may peace and power elevation be to you guys. Okay. If you are watching from Facebook, then you go ahead and share my Facebook channel. I mean, my Facebook page, my video. If you are watching from YouTube, you can go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Okay. And if you like what I'm doing and you want to support or you want to help out, you can go ahead and hit that Cash App. That's my Cash App information. So if you want to contribute and you want to do something, then you're more than welcome. Until then, take it easy on yourselves, all right? May peace and power elevation be to all of you. And thank you for tuning in, all right? Until next time. And we're going to talk about the spirituality or spiritual science called Obeah. All right, so we're going to get into Obeah and what that is, all right? Until then, peace.